Boldwood presents Happy Ever After at Puddleduck Farm. Written by Della Galton and read by Karen Cass. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. A wonderful sense of peace filled the Puddleduck Farm kitchen on that Sunday evening in January. Frost sparkled on the trees outside, but the kitchen was toasty warm. The Aga belted out heat, and the air smelled deliciously of cinnamon apple crumble and custard, a pan of which still sat beside the hot plate. 3 dogs curled up on the warm flagstones in various parts of the kitchen, but the room was huge, so you could have comfortably fitted in several more without tripping over any of them. An Irish wolfhound, a black Labrador, and a half-grown Dalmatian were a breeze. Phoebe Dashwood and her grandmother Maggie, whose kitchen it was, sat opposite each other at one end of the old farmhouse table. It seated 12 at a push, so there was plenty of room for them to spread out. The remains of a cheese ploughman's supper and a crumble dessert were scattered across its wooden surface, wood which was polished smooth by years of dinners and dozens of family memories. "I should get this lot cleared up," Maggie said. "I'll do it in a sec," Phoebe promised. "There's no rush. Nothing ever happens on a Sunday evening." She eyed her grandmother speculatively across the table. "I'm not expecting a call-out tonight." She thought fleetingly of Sam, her other half, who'd stayed at home while she'd nipped over for a girly supper with her grandmother. She hoped she could head straight home to him rather than via a chilly stable on that cold January night. Phoebe owned and ran Puddleduck Vets from a converted barn on her grandmother's land, which in its heyday had been a dairy farm, but was now an animal sanctuary. Puddleduck Pets, not to be confused with Puddleduck Vets, was home to a selection of cats, including a half-feral ginger tom called Saddam, a kennel full of dogs, several ducks, 3 donkeys, and any other animal in need of care and protection. Puddleduck Vets shared out-of-hours emergency work with Marchwood Vets, another local practice, and it was Phoebe's turn to cover the night shift. She yawned and looked at her phone, which remained comfortingly silent. It was just after 8:30 p.m. "I'll probably head home soon," she told her grandmother, "although I do appreciate you making me supper. The cinnamon apple crumble was amazing." The kitchen still smelled deliciously of the latter, and Phoebe sniffed the air appreciatively. "It was, wasn't it?" Maggie looked smug. "It's a new recipe I found online." "Online, get you. Since when did you go hunting for recipes online?" Maggie was well known for her aversion to all things technical, despite the fact Phoebe and the rest of her family had been trying to get her to use a mobile phone, or even a landline, come to that, for years. "Since Eddie showed me an easy way to do it, I'd have picked it up ages ago if someone had shown me properly before, instead of just rushing through things at top speed. Eddie's got patience." Eddie was her new husband, and despite the fact they'd known each other forever, they were still in the honeymoon stage of their marriage, and he could do no wrong. Maggie clicked her tongue and gave Phoebe a look that dared her to comment, either about Eddie's patience or her newly acquired technical skills. "I've been onlining loads lately. I'll have you know I'm an expert onliner. I could probably write a guide for it. You know, for beginner onliners and old people. Eddie said I took to it like a pro." "Good for you." Phoebe suppressed a smile. She was way too content and replete with food to call Maggie out on this one. Her grandmother was in her mid-70s, not that she looked it, with her brown hair still barely touched with grey and her sparkling eyes, hazel brown, the same colour as Phoebe's. She still had the kind of energy that made Phoebe, who was 37, feel breathless and exhausted sometimes. There was a tiny silence, and then, before either of them could speak again, the blare of Phoebe's mobile broke it. She reached for it, seeing immediately a number she didn't recognise. A client after all, then. "Hello, Puddleduck Vets, can I help you?" The woman's voice came in gasps. "Oh, thank goodness, I've got a person, not an answer machine. I'm sorry to call so late, but I don't think it can wait. I'm so worried. It's Primrose, my little dog." "What seems to be the problem?" Phoebe shifted in her chair. The concern in the woman's voice made Phoebe straighten her back, and she switched automatically into professional mode. We think she's got something terribly wrong, something internal. My husband thinks it might be bladder cancer or even kidney cancer. She's got all the symptoms, you see. She's peeing blood. She's not in season. She's been spayed. We're so worried. She's so little. My husband Googled it. It wasn't just grandmothers who could become expert onliners, Phoebe thought wryly. The internet made everyone an authority these days. Phoebe interrupted gently. Please don't worry. What kind of dog is Primrose and how old is she? Is she registered with us? She's a Cocker Spaniel, only 3. We're so worried, and yes, we usually see lovely Max, Mr. Jones, at the practice. And what's your name, please? Amy Lidford. Lovely Max was Phoebe's junior vet. He was a favourite with all her female clients because of his charming manner and meticulous care. His Hugh Grant voice and rugged good looks didn't go amiss either. I'm Phoebe Dashwood, Max's boss. I'm on call tonight. Would you be able to bring Primrose into the surgery? Does she seem well enough? Yes, she does. I will. Oh, thank you so much. Shall we come now? If you can, that would be great. And please, Phoebe had been about to say, don't worry, but the call had already disconnected. She turned to Maggie, who'd been listening to the whole exchange with interest and was now leaning forward, her eyes curious. That sounded serious. Yes, I think it might be. She relayed what the woman had said, and Maggie nodded thoughtfully. Bless you. So much for a quiet Sunday then, huh? Phoebe nodded. It's most likely a urinary infection, but they're panicking, bless them. I expect they've been doing the tippy-tappy dance, haven't they? Tippy-tappy dance? Eddie calls it the tippy-tappy onliner dance. Maggie rolled her eyes. When folk do the tippy-tappy dance and find things on the World Wide Webby. Right, Phoebe said. It was a whole new world, or at least a whole new language, but then as Eddie was pretty deaf and he and her grandmother mostly communicated in a mixture of British Sign Language with their own made-up bits thrown in for good measure, it wasn't entirely surprising they had different names for things than most people. And now they think they're expert onliners, Maggie added. Phoebe nodded. Her grandmother clearly saw no irony whatsoever in this situation. She was thinking of a tactful answer when Maggie continued. Some people will do anything to get out of the washing up. I'm not getting out of the washing up. I can do it now before I go. No need. You go off and perform your veterinary magic. Maggie gathered the plates, clinking the cutlery, and the 3 dogs woke up as one and started looking interested in case there were leftovers. Tiny the wolfhound and Buster the old Labrador didn't bother getting up, but Roxy, Phoebe's 6-month-old Dalmatian, stretched and came eagerly across. Go on, off you go. Maggie waved her hands at Phoebe. I'll look after Roxy while you sort out the spaniel. I'll put the plates in the sink to soak. Eddie can do them when he comes back from seeing his son. One of them's his anyway, she smirked. He took off at lightning speed as soon as he'd polished up the last scrap. Thought that would get him out of the washing up. Huh, men. They both smiled. The warmth in her grandmother's voice told Phoebe she didn't mean a word of it. Maggie would be washing up as soon as Phoebe left the kitchen. Independent and feisty she might be, but she loved looking after people and, of course, animals. She'd loved looking after her husband, Farmer Pete, when he'd been alive, and she loved looking after Eddie now, no matter how much she pretended to complain about him. Good luck, Maggie called after her. Thank you. Amy Lidford and a man who looked every bit as fretful as his wife arrived 20 minutes later. They rushed into the surgery reception, where Phoebe had just put on all the lights. The man was carrying Primrose wrapped in a tartan blanket, and Phoebe's heart sank. Oh, goodness, they clearly hadn't been exaggerating about their little dog's condition if she needed to be carried. Let's get her up onto the examining table and I can have a proper look at her, she said, as Mr. Lidford, please call me James, lifted the little dog up and unwrapped the blanket. Hello, little one. Are you not feeling so good? Phoebe petted the spaniel's head. She was brown and white, and to Phoebe's relief, now she could see her properly, The little dog's eyes were bright and alert. Apart from the fact she was panting slightly, which was no doubt caused by the stress of her journey and her clinical surroundings, she seemed absolutely fine. Phoebe checked her over carefully while Primrose submitted patiently to her ministrations. There was no sign of anemia, no temperature, no disturbing swellings anywhere. Nothing that looked abnormal at all. Phoebe frowned, slightly puzzled, and then wished she'd kept a poker face when Amy Lidford jumped to conclusions. "Oh my goodness, it's serious, isn't it?" She wrung her hands together. "What are you thinking?"
"Yes, please tell us," James added, his eyes anxious. "We need to know the worst. We have insurance."
"I'm thinking we should do a urine test before we jump to any conclusions," Phoebe told them both. "So what I'd really like to do is to collect a sample now from Primrose, and then we can start ruling things out." "Is there a medical way of doing that? Or do we have to wait for her to go?" Amy asked. "The least invasive way is to wait for her to go. I'll just get a scoop and we can pop outside." A short while later, the three of them were outside in the pitch black of the yard, following Primrose around with a torch and a sterile container, and leaning forward swiftly every time it looked as though the dog was going to squat. It was a moonless night. Low cloud obscured the stars, but it was freezing, and Primrose was obviously in no hurry at all to oblige them. She was far too interested in all the amazing new sniffs she had found. Dogs, cats, donkeys, people, the yard must be a sniff heaven for dogs. They had spent about 10 fruitless minutes getting colder and colder. Phoebe's knees had actually gone numb before Amy said, "She doesn't like going on concrete. She'll never wee on the concrete at home. It has to be grass. Is there any grass anywhere?" "Yes, of course. We can take her up to the small paddock." Phoebe puffed out a clouded breath of relief. "Good idea. Maybe we should give her a drink as well. Would that help?" Both Amy and James nodded emphatically, and Phoebe rushed back into the surgery to get a bowl of water and a bigger torch, terrified Primrose would perform before she came back again. Luckily, Primrose didn't. She was way too excited about the prospect of a nighttime walk to stop long enough in one place for a wee. She wasn't even that interested in the bowl of water or the hypoallergenic treats Phoebe had collected. She tugged on her lead and danced about. "She doesn't much like going in public either," Amy mentioned suddenly. "Have you noticed that, James?"
"I have, yes."
"Maybe there's too many of us. Maybe if just me and the vet go up to the paddock."
"Sure thing, I'll go back and wait in the surgery."
James sounded relieved as he put his hands in his coat pockets and turned back. Phoebe wished she'd thought to put on her coat when she'd left the farmhouse. She hadn't expected to be wandering around a field in the freezing cold. So much for nothing ever happening on Sunday evenings. That would teach her to tempt fate. Carrying the bowl of water and the sterile container and flashing the torch to show the way, she walked alongside Amy and Primrose towards Maggie's small paddock, which was currently empty of animals, but once more, Primrose refrained from weeing. Phoebe had a sudden urge to laugh. This would be comical if it wasn't so serious. She must not laugh. She wasn't sure Amy would be able to see the funny side. One thing she was 100% sure about, though, was that if Primrose didn't go soon, her hands would be too numb to hold the flaming container. "She's going to do it! She's doing it! Now!" Phoebe leapt into action, and to her immense relief, her lightning reflexes meant she caught some of the precious liquid, even though Primrose had caught her off guard. "Bingo," she said triumphantly. "Well done, Primrose. Right then, let's get this sample tested." "You can do that now?" "I can, yes." They walked back in companionable silence. It was wonderful to be back in the relative warmth of the surgery, where Phoebe asked Primrose's owners to wait with their dog in reception while she did the necessary tests. She'd been hoping this whole thing was a storm in a teacup. It certainly didn't look like there was much wrong with Primrose, except for the fact her urine was red. Phoebe could see that clearly in the lights of the surgery. No wonder the Lidfords had panicked. Phoebe would have been worried too. But to her surprise, the urine dipstick test showed everything to be normal. Feeling as though she was in some surreal nightmare, Phoebe did a PCV test, grateful she'd recently invested in a centrifuge and could do them on site. There were no red blood cells present. Phoebe stared at the result with a frown on her face. Whatever was colouring the dog's urine certainly wasn't blood then. It was completely baffling. Chapter 2. Phoebe stood in the examining room of her surgery, racking her brains. There had to be some explanation, but she had no idea what it was. She'd been freezing outside, but now she'd thawed out, her fingers were tingling, her head ached, and she felt hot with stress. What on earth was she going to tell James and Amy Lidford, who were sitting patiently waiting for her in reception on the other side of the door? She was going to have to say something. She couldn't just tell them that, as far as she was concerned, there was absolutely nothing wrong with Primrose, other than the fact she had a rather odd shade of urine. She stared hard at what remained of the sample. Could she Google it? Or maybe ask on the online vet forum she was on? There was bound to be someone up late. Hopefully they'd be a dog expert who specialised in urology. She thought of Maggie's expert onliner phrase, and her head throbbed with the irony. A burst of laughter from the other side of the door stirred her from her musings. At least the couple weren't as anxious as they'd been when they'd arrived. Not if they were laughing. She could hear voices. More than two voices. The third one sounded like Maggie. What was she doing over here? There was more laughter and... was that clapping she could hear? Totally mystified, Phoebe opened the door and poked her head out. Is everything okay? Oh, hi, Maggie. Hello, darling. Maggie glanced at her with affection. I just came to check everything was all right. I saw lights in the field. Sorry, that was us. Yes, so I've been told. Trying to collect a sample in the dark. Always tricky. Did you get anywhere with it? No, not really. Well, except to discover everything seems normal. Oh, that's such a relief, Amy said, if you'll excuse the pun. With a grin, she glanced at Maggie. I think it was right, what you said. She looked back towards Phoebe. Your senior vet had a theory on what might be wrong with Primrose. She's seen it before. Has she really? Phoebe looked at Maggie suspiciously. Yes, she'd been looking after animals for decades, but she didn't actually have any veterinary qualifications. Not that this had stopped her handing out advice when she'd done a brief stint for Phoebe as a receptionist in the early days of Puddleduck Vets. Yep, it's beetroot, Maggie said confidently. It dyes your wee pink. Very alarming, but completely harmless. Granted, but dogs don't usually eat beetroot, Phoebe said, although her heart had leapt in response to the suggestion. Maggie was definitely on to something. There were probably other foods that could do the same thing. Primrose doesn't eat beetroot, James said, but as we were just saying, she does eat Tyrrell's vegetable crisps. She loves them, and they have quite a bit of beetroot in them. We had some friends round for a finger buffet last night, and I'd put some bowls of crisps out. I thought it was odd. There were none at all left over. The little monkey must have pinched them. He stroked his dog's head, and she wagged her tail from side to side. The slow wag of a dog who thinks she might be in trouble. It's okay, Angel, it's fine. You can eat as many Tyrrell's crisps as you like. Amy dropped to the floor, grabbed her dog's head, and planted a kiss on her soft brown head. Oh my goodness, what a palaver! All that worry, and it was just beetroot crisps. Would you believe it? Is that what you think it was too? James looked at Phoebe hopefully. There's not a more sinister explanation? There certainly doesn't appear to be. All the tests are normal. Phoebe didn't know whether to feel massively relieved or slightly miffed she hadn't spotted the problem before Maggie had. Deciding it didn't matter, the main thing was the outcome was good. She smiled at the couple. Just keep an eye on her, but I think beetroot crisps are most definitely the root cause of the problem, if you'll excuse the pun. Everyone laughed at the weak joke. They were all high on relief. James was nodding his head. That's great news. We're sorry we've wasted your time. I'll come and settle up. I take it we won't have to pay for the second opinion? No, Phoebe said, before realising he was joking. All's well that ends well, Maggie said, as they both waved the couple off a few minutes later, with Primrose trotting happily beside them. When the night had swallowed them up once more, Phoebe closed the practice door and turned to Maggie. "Senior vet, huh? I didn't tell him that, he just assumed, and I saw no point in correcting him. He thinks he's got a good deal now." She raised her eyebrows. "2 vets for the price of 1. Great deal. Besides, I was right, wasn't I?" "You were right, thank you, Gran." "Can we stick to senior vet? I prefer that to Gran." "Senior vet and expert onliner," Phoebe said, sticking her tongue firmly in her cheek. "Perfect," Maggie said. "Good grief, look at the time. It's gone 10. Where's that dirty stop-out, Eddie? Be off with you, junior vet." They both snorted with laughter. Phoebe called Roxy and was waving goodbye when dirty stop-out Eddie arrived home again. There was a lot of laughter the next day too when Phoebe reported the events of the previous evening to her staff in the gap between them starting work and opening the doors of Puddleduck Vets for the first appointment of the day. Lovely Max was on holiday this week. He was seeing his family for a belated Christmas catch-up. It was the middle of January, but it seemed to Phoebe that lots of people had their Christmas festivities in the quieter first month of the year these days. Marcus, her receptionist, who was currently training to be an animal behaviourist, and Jenna, her vet nurse, real name Jennifer Aniston, but who called herself Jenna so everyone could differentiate between her and the famous one, at least that was her story, both gasped with relief and mirth when Phoebe told them about Primrose's visit. "I bet your face was a picture when Maggie rocked up with her diagnosis," Jenna said. "Thank goodness she was right. It could have been tricky if she'd told them it was just beetroot and then you'd gone out and said there was a serious problem." "Yes, I know. I don't think they'd have believed me." "Geez." The same thought had crossed Phoebe's mind. But I think they'd already told her Primrose had been eating beetroot crisps, so it wasn't a totally wild guess. The main thing is that she's okay. It was a happy ending. "We like happy endings," Marcus said, glancing at them both, his face serene. "We don't always get them, do we?" "We get them as often as we possibly can," Phoebe said happily. Marcus was currently going out with Natasha, who was Maggie's young pet sanctuary manager and adored animals almost as much as Maggie did. Marcus and Natasha were perfect for each other, and Phoebe was hoping for a happy ending there too. "So, what have we got on today?" she asked them. "I'm doing the health check and nail trimming clinic," Jenna said, "and you're on appointments and whatever else crops up." Phoebe nodded and she went and turned the sign on the door from closed to open. "Bring it on," she said. Mondays were always busy. Phoebe thought this was partly because people liked to get appointments done early in the week, and partly because they held off from bringing their pets in over the weekend so they didn't have to pay out-of-hours charges. That Monday was no different. By the end of it, Phoebe had seen a cat with fur balls, an injured chicken, a dog with a tummy upset, and a rabbit with an ear infection. She'd spayed a cat in the afternoon with Jenna's help. There had been no emergencies, nothing unexpected, although she had a call-out on a farm to see a bull on the way home. Apparently, Titus had a problem with sore gentleman bits. At least that's what the dairyman had told her. Even in this day and age, some dairymen still didn't like to discuss the male genital problem of their animals with a female vet. They'd skirt around the subject, and there would be long pauses while they did anything and everything to avoid saying the actual names of the parts in question. Phoebe had heard all sorts of phrases, varying from, "He's got a wonky donger," to, "His lunchbox is short of a tomato." It was usually less problematic when she got there, because then they didn't need words. The dairyman could just point at the affected organ, which they seemed to find a lot easier. To Phoebe's relief, when she arrived to see Titus, the dairyman had gone off duty and she ended up seeing the farmer instead, who was a woman and quite happy to discuss the problem in more detail. "I think he's got an infection in his balls, bless him." She raised her eyebrows. "Occupational hazard, but we'll need to get on top of it pronto, so he can carry on getting on top of things pronto, so to speak." She winked. "Can't have young Titus out of action for too long." The farmer's diagnosis was correct. Phoebe administered antibiotics and a painkiller and left the farm, secure in the knowledge that Titus would at least be more comfortable now. Most of the dairy industry used artificial insemination these days, but of course they still needed a bull, and the equipment needed had to be scrupulously clean, or there was trouble all round. Phoebe finally got home to Woodcutter's cottage just after 8 p.m. She was tired out already, and it was only Monday, but thankfully she was no longer on out-of-hours call. She'd handed over the baton of 24-hour call-out to a vet at Marchwood. Phoebe knew she'd be forever grateful to the Marchwood practice, or, more specifically, to its owner, Seth Harding. She'd gone to work at Marchwood when she'd first moved back to the New Forest from London, and Seth had been a great mentor. Up until she'd met Seth, she'd specialised in small animal practice, but he'd introduced her to the rewards and challenges of treating larger animals, and Phoebe had found she loved that too. She wouldn't have liked to have given up either. The variety was what made her job so worthwhile. Since she'd set up Puddleduck Vets, she'd treated alpacas, koonie pigs, and a plethora of sheep and cows, as well as numerous dogs, cats, guinea pigs, hamsters, and pet rats. The oddest patient she'd ever been called out to had been a crayfish called Reggie, whose young owner had suspected he was dead, but fortunately he'd just shed his shell, as crustaceans needed to do when they'd outgrown their last one. This had been before she'd even worked for Seth. In fact, he'd joked back then that it was her reputation for bringing animals back from the dead that had prompted him to employ her. The oddest client Phoebe had ever had to deal with was more difficult to pinpoint. There had been Alice Connor, who called all of her male animals Boris, no matter what the species. Alice looked as though she'd stepped out of a 1950s film, despite being only in her mid-30s. She hadn't been very keen on talking about problems of a sexual nature either, Phoebe seemed to remember. Then there had been Mr. B, the tall and gangly chef, who had point-blank refused to give her his actual name because he'd been so paranoid about identity theft. He was also fixated on avoiding hidden cameras, not that Phoebe had any cameras in her surgery, hidden or otherwise. Mr. B had been the owner of the koonie pigs. He'd insisted he couldn't see any vet but her, which had been annoying when Max had been out to him already, but Phoebe had softened towards Mr. B considerably when she'd seen how much he doted on his koonies. Knickerbocker Gloria was a strong contender for the Oddest Client Award too. She'd registered with the surgery last year and had told everyone who would listen that she'd been a pole dancer in her youth. Knickerbocker Gloria was her stage name, and she'd wanted to bring in her 101 guinea pigs to get their claws clipped. Having beaten Phoebe down in price because she'd claimed she was a poverty-stricken pensioner, she'd then turned up in vintage designer clothes and clearly wasn't broke at all. Phoebe loved all of her clients, even the odd ones. She wouldn't have swapped her job for anything. In fact, she thought, when she finally unlocked the front door of Woodcutter's cottage and stepped inside, she wouldn't have swapped any part of her life at all. "Anyone home?" she shouted, knowing there was because the lounge light was on. Sam, her partner, soulmate, and long-term best friend, called a greeting from the lounge.
"Hi, love. You're earlier than I thought. How was the call-out?"
Roxy, who'd gone to work with Sam today, arrived just ahead of him to greet her. The half-grown Dalmatian's tail was wagging so frantically that her whole body wagged with it. Phoebe hugged them both, breathing in the faint smell of soap on Sam's skin. He'd obviously showered already, and the warm puppy smell of her dog. "I must admit, it's wonderful coming home to you two. The call-out was fine. I saw a bull with sore testicles."
"Stop there."
Sam put his hands up to ward off her words.
"I definitely don't want to know any more details."
He grinned at her, and she smiled back into his gorgeous blue eyes and leaned forward to push back an unruly lock of hair. "What is it with you men? I thought there were no taboo subjects these days."
"There are definitely taboo subjects," Sam said, "or icky ones anyway. Especially just before we eat supper. I made chicken soup, and I got some of that cornbread you liked from the supermarket. Hope that's okay."
"You are the most awesome fiancé ever. Do you know that?"
You're pretty awesome yourself. Shall I serve it up while you get a shower?
He glanced pointedly at her hands.
After seeing the, bull?
I have washed my hands, you know.
Phew.
But I will have a shower.
Cool. Don't be too long.
Sam headed towards the kitchen.
There are some things I want to talk through with you.
Chapter 3. Phoebe wondered what things Sam wanted to discuss as she stood under the shower, luxuriating in the hot water pummeling her skin. One of the things she really liked about Woodcutter's cottage was its modern shower. It was probably the only modern thing about it, she mused, lifting her face to wash off the day. Woodcutter's cottage was a tiny, 2-up, 2-down, 17th century cob cottage with a thatched roof, tucked away up an unmade road beside a woodland near Linwood, which was a stone's throw from Puddleduck Farm. It was incredibly handy for work. It didn't belong to Phoebe. She rented it from Tori, who'd been her best friend for as long as she could remember. Tori, Sam, Phoebe, and Fraser, Phoebe's younger brother, had grown up together, and much of their time had been spent at Puddleduck Farm. It had been an idyllic childhood, growing up in the countryside with the whole of the New Forest as their backyard. Phoebe had left briefly to live in London with another vet, Hugh, she'd met at veterinary school. More recently, she'd even had a dalliance with the resident lord of the manor, Rufus Holt, but both of these men had turned out to be emotionally unavailable, to her at least. Rufus had since got engaged to his son's live-in nanny. Then Phoebe had finally noticed what was right under her nose, and what her friends and family had known for ages, that Sam Hendry, whose mother Jan was best friends with Phoebe's own mother Luella, was the perfect man for her. They'd got together the previous July, and Phoebe still had trouble believing just how amazing it felt to be with Sam. Although she'd been close friends with him for as long as she could remember, she'd thought there would be no chemistry. She had been so wrong. From the moment they had first kissed, the chemistry between them had grown and grown. She loved everything about Sam, his integrity, his love of animals, his perceptiveness, his thoughtfulness, his stoic nature, his straightforwardness, and his utter reliability. She loved the fact he was a hard worker, and he was very family-orientated too. He worked at Hendry's Post Office and Stores, which was his mother's business in Bridgeford, a New Forest town on the banks of the River Avon, on the borders of Hampshire and Dorset. He also worked as a riding instructor on the weekends at Brook Stables in the forest, which helped to pay for his own horse, Ninja, who was kept there. On Christmas Day, Sam had asked Phoebe to marry him, and since then they'd been living in two places because Sam owned a first-floor maisonette in Bridgeford, and although it had a garden, this wasn't connected to the flat's back door. It was harder work having Roxy there because it meant going downstairs with her and round to the back garden every time she wanted to go out. As well as Ninja, Sam also had Snowball, a black cat, so life was pretty full on. Maybe Sam wanted to talk about that. Living at two places was only a temporary measure. They planned to buy their own place together, and although they were in no hurry to set a date for their wedding, buying a house together would make day-to-day life a whole lot easier. The sooner she finished her shower, the sooner she'd find out. Phoebe dried off quickly, dressed in comfy slob-about clothes, and skipped downstairs. Woodcutter's was a great cottage, and she suspected Tori would probably be willing to sell it to them, but it was very small. Ultimately, the answer was to sell Sam's place and buy a bigger place together. She stood in the kitchen doorway, breathing in the delicious scents of chicken soup. Sam could cook, too. That was another thing to add to the long list of things she liked about him. She took an appreciative breath. "Wow, that smells good," she murmured, as he turned from the stove, brandishing a wooden spoon. "What did I do to deserve you?"
"You must have been very good in a previous life," he winked. "And it is pretty good, if I do say so myself. Shall I serve it up?"
"Definitely." They ate at the little table in the small kitchen. More often, they ate off trays on their laps in the lounge, but soup was definitely safer at the table, especially with Roxy around, who was inclined to try and jump on a lap if she could. Neither of them spoke again till they'd emptied their bowls, and Sam was wiping his clean with a hunk of fresh bread. Then Phoebe leaned forward expectantly. So, what's all this important stuff we have to chat about then? His eyes brightened.
I thought we should start looking for a house. I know there's no rush, and there are a couple of things I want to do over at mine first, but there's no harm in seeing what's around, is there?
I couldn't agree more. What things need doing at yours?
Nothing major. A lick of paint to spruce things up. Maybe a better carpet in the bedroom. The kitchen's still all right. Dad and I did that when I bought the place.
Sam's father was a joiner and kitchen fitter. Can I help? Phoebe asked.
Sam shook his head. You've got enough to do.
So have you, Sam. I don't mind wielding a paintbrush.
Let's see how we go.
His eyes warmed.
This is my quietest time of year at Brook. Not many people bother with riding lessons in January. It's too cold.
I don't blame them. Okay, good plan. But I can still help.
Keeping Snowball and Roxy out of the way while I paint would be a help, he said thoughtfully. And actually, I was hoping I might be able to drag Ma over for a night of painting and mother-son bonding. If I tell her I need a hand with the painting, I think she'll come. She's improved in leaps and bounds lately, and I think she'd feel safe at the flat.
Sam's mother suffered periodically from agoraphobia, which had initially been caused by postnatal depression, and last year it had flared up again. Thankfully, she was now having counselling for it, and she was doing really well. That's a nice idea, Phoebe said. Okay, I'll keep Roxy out of the way when you do the painting. Puppy classes start next week, so that might be a good opportunity to get your mum over.
Brilliant. When are the classes?
They start next Thursday night in the Bridgeford Community Centre. I've got the details on a card Marcus gave me. She rummaged in her bag. Here we are, Paula's Puppy Pals. It's a 6:30 p.m. start.
Phoebe turned the business card over in her hands. On the back, there were 3 paw prints alongside a picture of a black Labrador.
She's pretty experienced by the sound of it. She's been dog training for 25 years.
Phoebe already had an image of Paula in her head, inspired by Marcus's description of a grey-haired maestro. She envisaged a motherly woman in her mid-60s wearing a tweed blazer and possibly a trilby hat. She wasn't sure where the hat image was coming from. She smiled fondly. We should probably have taken her to classes when she was a bit younger for the whole socialising thing they're supposed to do, but it all got a bit hectic in December, what with Gran's wedding and Tori having the baby, not to mention Christmas. Anyway, she gets plenty of socialising with other dogs at Puddleduck. She likes other dogs. I'm sure she'll be fine, even if she is the biggest puppy there. Famous last words, Phoebe thought on the following Thursday night when she rushed into Bridgeford Community Centre slightly late. She charged through the wide double doors that opened onto a foyer and bumped slap-bang into a woman with a young black and tan German shepherd. She wasn't sure which dog was the most surprised, but the young shepherd was the most vocal. He pulled and strained on his lead, stood on his hind legs, and barked loudly at Roxy. Roxy, not to be outdone, barked back, and then threw in a couple of growls for good measure. The shepherd retaliated. The foyer had vinyl flooring where the slightest noise reverberated loudly, so it all sounded much worse than it was. Blushing furiously, Phoebe hauled Roxy away across the slippery floor before there was a full-scale kick-off. Before either she or the shepherd's owner could speak, a tall woman in jeans and a Barber coat came rushing out of an internal door that Phoebe could see led into a big hall where some other dogs were all quietly behaving. Phoebe presumed the woman was Paula, although she didn't look like Phoebe had expected. So much for the smiley tweed motherly character she'd imagined. This woman was thin-faced and did not look happy. "Goodness me, what is all this row? Enough already! Pack it in this instant!" To Phoebe's amazement, both dogs shut up immediately and looked at Paula with something akin to respect. "Wow," said the shepherd's owner. "You clearly have the touch."
"I should hope so after 25 years in the business." Paula looked slightly less cross. "What happened there?" "I think the dogs were a bit startled to see each other. Bertie isn't used to other dogs." "It was my fault," Phoebe apologised. "I was rushing and I didn't realise there was another dog about." "Lesson 1, Paula said. Don't take dogs for granted. Always introduce dogs slowly and calmly. After all, we'd probably have something to say about it. if a complete stranger charged up to us full pelt, would we not? She glanced at Phoebe. How old is your Dalmatian? She's 5.5 months. And you're just bringing her to puppy class now. She might be better in a class for older dogs. Taken aback, Phoebe said, I did mention it on the phone. We haven't been to a class before, and I think you said the puppy class would be a good place to start. She is still a puppy. Ah, yes, I do remember. You're the vet, aren't you? Paula frowned. That's right. Phoebe felt wrong-footed. You'd better come in then. You're the last to arrive. Paula held the door open. I'd really appreciate it if you could try and arrive on time in future. Phoebe and the German Shepherd's owner exchanged chastened glances as they followed Paula into a large hall where Phoebe could see there were already 4 dogs with their owners, spaced at intervals, each of them standing next to a yellow fluorescent cone. Did they all look smugly complacent, or was that just Phoebe's fevered imagination? She decided she was being oversensitive. Nevertheless, it was not a good start. The evening didn't get any better either. Roxy, who had never barked at other dogs and loved everybody, had clearly been rattled by her earlier experience, and Phoebe couldn't take her near to any of the other pups without her lunging and barking again. To make matters worse, all the other canine participants, which included a cute brown dachshund, a yellow Labrador pup, and 2 cockapoos, were much smaller than Roxy, and their owners threw Phoebe reproachful glares as she repeatedly hauled Roxy away, muttering, She's never done that before. I'm so sorry. She normally loves other dogs. It was obvious no one believed her, and as the hour class wore on and she was forced to leave a big gap between her and the other dogs, she felt more and more like a pariah. The one area where Roxy did shine was when they learned their first exercise, which was sit. Roxy had been sitting on command since she was a tiny pup, and she was more than happy to plonk her bottom on the floor at top speed as soon as she was asked, especially if there was a treat involved. Very good, Paula said when she came to check their progress. She's a natural. She looked at Roxy consideringly. I am wondering, though, if you might be better off in my later class, where there will be more dogs her age. They're bigger in that class too. Can you make 8:15 p.m. on a Thursday? Possibly, Phoebe said, or if I can't, my partner may be able to. Is it okay if there's more than one trainer? It's fine. In fact, I'd encourage it. Half the battle of dog training is continuity, so it really helps if everyone who has contact with the puppy is involved. Do you have kids? Ideally, I'd like the whole family to come to training classes. Paula smiled encouragingly, and Phoebe found herself warming to her a bit more. Okay, thanks, and no, we don't have kids, but my partner Sam is very happy to be involved. It sounds like fun, Sam said, when Phoebe reported back to him later that night. And the later start would be better for me. It means I can nip in and sort out Ninja after work first. We could both go, Phoebe suggested. Paula said the more the merrier, as far as she was concerned. Great. Let's play it by ear then. She nodded. The prospect of Sam coming along to the dog training class with her next Thursday was a cheering one. Moral support. Perfect. The following week at Puddleduck Vets turned into one of the busiest weeks Phoebe could remember. Not only did there seem to be a surfeit of problems with their existing clients' animals, they also had 4 new clients register, 2 of whom had just moved into the area and 2 of whom had come via recommendations. Phoebe loved it when new clients registered, particularly when they came via recommendation. It meant her business was a success, although she was aware that if they kept expanding their client base, they were going to need another vet. She'd been aware of this at the end of last year, but hadn't had time to do anything about it yet. It was a catch-22 situation. The more clients they had, the more pressurized she felt to employ a third vet, but also the less able she felt to take any time out to interview one. It was Max, back now from his leave, who came up with the solution. Jenna and I can cover the practice for a few days while you and Maggie do the selection process and interviewing, he suggested. Maggie? Phoebe questioned. I'm not sure. She's not really qualified. Don't let her hear you say that, Jenna said. It was Maggie who wanted you to employ Marcus, wasn't it? And he hasn't turned out too bad. Marcus, who was in earshot at the time of this conversation, although pretending not to listen, blushed scarlet. Phoebe shot him a smile across reception. It wasn't just Maggie's idea. You came highly recommended, she told him.
Thanks, boss. Marcus, who'd worn a suit to work when she'd first employed him and had insisted on calling her boss, always reverted to formal mode when he was stressed.
Will we be getting another receptionist, too? I'm not sure. Do you think we need one?
At the moment, Marcus and Jenna covered reception between them, and if they needed holiday cover, Maggie was happy to step in. Or they could use a temp agency, which Phoebe tried not to do. I don't think we need anyone else, Marcus said staunchly. If it's not broke, don't fix it, Max added, flicking them both a glance.
Okay, Phoebe said. I'll just look for a vet for now. We're not going to be doing longer hours, so we can keep reception as it is for now. I'll speak to Maggie about the interviewing.
Maggie, as she'd suspected, was delighted.
Come to supper on Thursday night. That's Eddie's darts night. We can chat about it then. We could do the tippy-tappy onliner dance together, couldn't we? Don't they have online portaloos for vet staff?
Portals, Phoebe said, giggling.
That's what I said, isn't it?
Maggie winked. Sometimes Phoebe was sure her grandmother deliberately said the wrong word just for its entertainment value. Maggie was as sharp as a tack, despite all her fooling.
The only problem with Thursday is it's dog training night, so I won't have much time. Phoebe hesitated. Although Sam did say he was happy to go this week, come to think of it.
Problem solved then. Sam will enjoy some quality time with that pup, I'm sure.
Okay, it's a date, Phoebe promised.
And on Thursday evening, when Sam called in to Puddleduck Farm to collect Roxy, she found to her surprise she was quite relieved at the prospect of not having to face Paula. Sam laughed when she mentioned it. I'm sure Paula will be an utter pussycat, he said, but I will report back later. See you back at home.
Chapter 4.
Paula of Paula's Puppy Pals was nothing like Sam had expected, he thought, as he strolled into the Bridgeford Community Centre early, having taken heed of Phoebe's dire warnings not to be late, and saw a tall blonde putting out what looked like traffic cones at strategic points around a large hall. It doubled up as a sports hall. It was marked out for badminton. Sam had a vague memory of playing here as a kid. Right now, he seemed to be the only one in attendance. He cleared his throat from the doorway. Hi, sorry if I'm too early, but it's our first visit. The woman turned, and Sam found himself face to face with the most stunning woman he'd ever seen. She had straight blonde hair pulled back into a clip, chiseled cheekbones and amber eyes. Sam did a double take. He'd never seen anyone with those colour eyes before. Maybe they were contact lenses. Are you Paula? Phoebe hadn't said anything about the trainer looking like a glamour model. He thought she'd said she was 60-something, too. This woman couldn't have been older than 25, and she looked like she'd be more suited to a catwalk than a dog walk. Maybe she was Paula's assistant.
No, I'm Destiny. I'm a colleague of hers.
She smiled at him, and those amazing eyes warmed.
Paula can't be with us tonight, unfortunately. She's broken her hip. I'm covering for her. We're friends, as well as colleagues. It's all been a bit hectic, as you can imagine.
Yes, sure. Sam blinked. I'm Sam, and this is Roxy. We joined the puppy class last week, but Paula thought, as Roxy was a bit older and bigger than most of the puppies, we'd be better off coming to this class instead.
Yes, I think you're on the list Paula gave me.
She crouched down and stroked Roxy under her chin.
You're rather gorgeous, aren't you, my love?
Roxy fawned beneath her touch, wriggled her whole body, and closed her eyes in ecstasy. Fleetingly, Sam knew how she felt. Being in Destiny's presence was like being under a spell. It wasn't just how she looked, although that was undoubtedly part of it. It was her whole presence. Warmth and confidence exuded from her. He felt as though someone had thrown a golden blanket over the three of them.
You don't see many Dalmatians about these days, Destiny continued. Gorgeous dogs. They used to be carriage dogs, I believe.
Yes, I think you're right.
But I think they were originally bred to be hunting dogs, guarding the borders of Dalmatia.
Really? I didn't know that.
There's a firefighting link, too, Destiny continued, standing up. In the days when there were horse-drawn fire engines, Dalmatians were used to guard the horses who tended to get antsy at the scene of a fire. Very brave dogs. She looked back into Sam's eyes. He gulped. He felt tongue-tied.
You, really know your stuff.
I learned it when I did my animal behaviorism degree. She smiled at him, causing dimples to appear in her cheeks. Knowing an animal's heritage and what they were bred for can tell us a lot about why they behave as they do today. I'm sorry, I haven't introduced myself properly. She held out her hand. I'm Destiny Doolittle. I have my own behavioral practice, Animal Magic. It's lovely to meet you.
Sam Hendry, Sam said, managing to gather himself a bit as he took her hand. That's a really apt name.